mind blown for most moderns.
Everything was fragmented and disconnected and disjointed.
You know, we'd love for people to scream at us on the comments section.
That'd be a rich man's problem.
That'd be a real.
That'd be a nice problem to have.
Do you know who really you are? Have you done a deep dive into the deep recesses of who you are?
Again, it's too scary. So, what are the most dangerous stories that we're telling as leaders and organizations right now?
Ooh. Most dangerous stories we are telling. Yeah. No, this is a good opening to the Sense and Signal podcast. I think the most dangerous stories that we're telling right now are the ones that we are least acknowledging. And there's really only 5 basic stories that we tell, and we kind of cycle through them and we mash them together, we combine them, and we throw them up in the air, and we try to make meaning out of those stories. But probably the most dangerous one these days is the stranger in the strange land story. Think the movie Shawshank Redemption. We're telling ourselves a story that we are disassociated from from meaning, disassociated from nature, disassociated even as leaders from our followers, even as followers from our organizations. And that becomes incredibly dangerous because identity, when it is unmoored from its roots, merely floats. And that's not good. At least that's my take. I think that Hana might have a different may have a different thought, or maybe she has an additional thought on that.
Well, I do agree that I think that the stories we don't acknowledge or we don't even recognize as stories are probably the ones that have the deepest impact, and they kind of dwell in the subconscious. I would say that the loss of meaning universally as at this moment is really what I would say is the most important story right now. And I would love to dive deeper into this idea of, what is storytelling and what narratives we are constructing all the time, and why it's important, but also why it's damaging at times. But I think the loss of meaning, something that you mentioned, is to me deeply personal, and yet it also resonates on a global scale, right? It's that time kind of huge upheaval, and we can all sense it. It's bubbling. It's this shared feeling of, what is this? I sometimes think people, when the Rome was falling, were experiencing this also. And maybe like Germany, 1931, 33, where like it's starting to crack. We're seeing the cracks. We don't have stories to make around this. We don't have the narrative to capture what's happening, yet we are sensing it. And I think deeply psychologically, as a group psyche, but also individually, we struggle with it. And I think that would be my answer to what's the one big story. I think the loss of meaning to me is the biggest story right now.
Which is kind of like the loss of story.
Yeah, exactly. I hear 2 things, actually. Two things. There is I heard from Jesan, there's a specific story that is a disconnect. And I think, Hana, you're also referring to a disconnect from the lack of pure story. And perhaps it's not just any kind of story that we want to talk about, but maybe we should just start trying to figure out what it means to reintroduce stories that are meaningful to the culture. And you started to touch on something, Hana, before we go too deep into this. What happens organizationally or socially if we don't get this right or correct this ship? Is that everybody?
I think Hana leaned in on it in referencing Germany, in a sort of pre-war period. I I think, well, I'm going to pull from Dostoevsky a little bit here. I'm going to go back to the Russians a little bit because they have some experience with the loss of story and then what happens after that. Um, you kind of
Hmm.
fall into chaos, or not kind of, you fall into chaos. You fall into disruption. You fall into disintegration. I mean, literally, you disintegrate, right? Um, Regardless of what you may believe about people struggling with atomized identity around gender and sexual preference, right? Or sexual behavior, regardless of what you may think about that in a moral or maybe even an ethical sense, or even a philosophical sense, you cannot deny that that is a signal through the noise of spiritual disintegration. And we've already seen this in several areas in an American context and in a broader Western culture context, in um, in real material ways where people are struggling to bring children into the world, where people are struggling to find definitions for even getting out of bed in the morning, or putting their or finding reasons to pursue work that is meaningful. Um,
Yeah, and there's a whole mental health aspect to it as
Correct.
well, right? We have a mental health crisis happening in the world
That's right.
today as well. Well, at least in the Western
That's right. That's
world.
right. And so
Yeah.
that is all part of that disintegration. Literally, the integration is falling apart, and you will fall into chaos. And by the way, um, Nietzsche called this back in the 1870s and 1880s. And while I'm no fan of Nietzsche, I've been very clear on that on my own podcast. I think he played a really clever game of two lies and a truth, and we can talk about that a little bit later. But I think the truth that he understood was that when you have a loss of meaning, then disintegration follows. What drove him crazy was he couldn't figure out how to reintegrate that thing. And I think that's a real challenge for Western man right now.
Hannah, what is storytelling? I mean, why is storytelling important?
Because unlike other mammals, we have this ability to think forward and make meaning. And our ability to make meaning is has developed over millennia to have a evolutionary, it has evolutionary um, purpose. We need to make meaning of sort of we can make meaning of the changing seasons and use it for agriculture. We can figure out how animals are migrating and when we can hunt them easier. um, we we know these things, and we have um, learned how to navigate, and the stories we tell are helping us be in the world. And it's not a small thing, right? Like, we all need to have a story that helps us, that anchors us in this world. Now, that's all great and wonderful. And we need stories, that the narratives that help us survive. So just, think about how at one point, when the Bronze Age ended, there was like a serious famine, and there was like a cold age, mini cold age, mini ice age, and a lot of people died. Right, like the population of the world apparently went to like 15-20% of what it was before, something staggering. And at that point, the humanity came up with this idea of solving this huge problem. Like, look, everybody's dying, that's a problem. How do we solve it? By social, so like we came up with a social solution, right? We came up with living in communities that are larger than just the smallest tribe. Now, when you think about it and you look at how we live with complete strangers and in cities, and we rely on work of complete strangers. How did we get here? Well, by developing these stories and ideas that led us to overcome fear, right? And it's both in it demonstrates itself in a lot of things, from hey, we can meet each other and just nod and do something like I'm friendly, and animals do that too, but then we can also
Right.
have other things, how to live together. Um, and so for all those reasons, the narrative and stories are important. It helps us. They help us not to be afraid, deadly afraid, right? When the storm comes, you're not going to die, because that's the Zeus, that's Zeus, and or that's the wrath of the god, or whoever your god is. And then the other story, and you can talk about
But
science
I mean, when
and
I
stories.
hear that though, one thing that comes to mind is something you said on the previous podcast, Hana, and I want to get Jesan's take on this and Jodah's take on it as well. Like you had said, we're terrible storytellers at times because our senses. It's difficult for us to really make sense of the world, right? Like we're constantly inputting bad data, which puts out bad stories. Like, oh, there's this guy on a Mount Olympus throwing down thunderbolts, and which is a great binding agent for that Greek culture, but really it's not true, right? It's not really getting to the core of reality.
Right. And so on one hand, it's helpful because it helps us sort of make sense. And at the same time, most of the stories are not helpful, right? They're helping you anchor yourself. But so often we get in this spiral of telling ourselves stories, and it can be, I'm going to bring it back to nowadays and give you a very specific example. I was talking to somebody who is a workaholic, and they are basically convinced that that's what they have. Like, the story in their head is, I have to work 50, 60 hours a week. I have to get up at 6 a.m. to go to gym. And I'm like, so you do not see your wife and you do not see your children until the very end of the day. And then it's like, so the story you're telling yourself about, this is my mission, this is what I have to do, is very different from what, like, Byron Katie comes to mind, where you go, or for that matter, the Stoics, who I think it was Zeno who would say, but is this true? Right? They both say the same thing. Is this true? Are you really saving your life and your wife by working 50, 60 hours a week? Or is it really that you're trying to avoid being together? Like, are you avoiding closeness? Are you avoiding some emotional connection, or whatever that could be? So I'm going to stop
Makes me
here.
wonder if therapy's it makes me wonder if therapy's really there to help us reconstruct news stories.
It doesn't make me wonder at all. I think that's what its purpose is. So, hey, Son, listening to all that, what's your reaction to this conversation in relationship to literature? Is there bad literature to read? To that you shouldn't be reading, that would say, and I don't mean pulp, although I love pulp, but is there stuff that can be antithetical, and maybe that's an opinion, but is there a dark side in that respect?
Yes, there's a dark side to literature. I would be mistaken if I did not confirm that. And we've all read. Let me frame it broadly. We've all read bad literature, right? I'm not talking about pulp novels. I'm a huge fan of comic books, or at least I was until some of them went off the rails 20 years ago. So I've had my fair share of junk food when it comes to literature, right? I'm
Mm-hmm.
also into cinema. I've watched my fair share of bad movies, things I shouldn't have watched, things I look back on later on. And I'm like, ugh, that was for a very specific time, and that doesn't really apply now. And the reason why is because the stories that we tell ourselves in literature, and we already obliquely referenced the Greek gods, and I want to go into the Hebraic religion, of Judaism, and then from that Christianity, which in essence killed all the gods, if you want to look at it that way, and replaced it with Jesus, right? If we're looking at the nature of sort of the literature that's wrapped around those stories, right, and the literary tropes we use to push those stories, can there be bad literature that gives us bad stories? Absolutely, for sure. Your mileage will vary on this. So if you're a person who really likes, I don't know, Andrew Vack's crime novels, I'm just going to pick on that guy. And he's a great writer, by the way. I've read Andrew Vack's, great writer. But I would not say that there's anything redeeming for leaders inside of an Andrew Vack's novel, because he's writing about a very specific type of pathology in a very specific kind of way to be entertaining, right? That's probably not literature you're going to get anything meaningful from as a story. It's probably not literature that's going to answer the question that Pontius Pilate asked Jesus, what is truth? Truly great question, by the way. Truly spectacular question. And I think that modern men and women, modern humans in our postmodern time, struggle with this idea that there could be many truths that create one reality. We struggle with this idea because we're looking for the one epistemic truth or the one epistemic answer. And the problem is we've created all of these boxes where meaning can exist. So you see this most notably, this is a big example, when religious people argue with scientists about creation, right? So the creation narrative is a story. It is a story. It says something deeper about the meaning behind humanity and the meaning behind creation. But is it a story of 13.9 billion years? I had somebody get after me about this on Twitter, and I was like, okay. Is it really a story about 13.9 billion years? No, because it's a different kind of truth. The scientific truth exists in this box, and the religious truth exists in this box. And by the way, both of them can be true at the same time. Mind blown for most moderns. You can actually walk and chew gum at the same time. Like, it's okay. You're not going to fly apart at the seams. But what we are looking for is the one answer or the one thing. And we're not going to get it this side of. We're not going to get it on this side of reality anyway. And
yeah, it makes me think of the movie Rashomon, or where it's and I don't even remember I don't think that the ghost was the one that supposedly had the ultimate reality. I can't remember if
I think the ghost was just another perspective. I think
was
all
it just
the
another
realities.
Perspective?
Yeah.
Okay. So there was no intent to suggest there is an ultimate reality. So
I think the whole point of Rashomon is the multiplicity of realities.
Well, you're seeing this in the Marvel movies now with Thanos. Thanos wanted to create one reality, snap my fingers, and boom, it's done. That is the ultimate sort of arrogant postmodern idea wrapped up in a superhero movie. Like, I can't think of anything more arrogant than that. I'm going to snap my fingers because I've decided. Boom, done. And we tried to take that and turn that into a heroic trope with Tony Stark at the end of that movie, but it didn't work. And the reason it doesn't work is because A, you can't snap your fingers and just wipe off a third of the people out of the galaxy.
I also thought it was a limited imagination because couldn't he have just double the size of the universe? Anyways, that's a different thing.
Yeah, well,
that's another thing.
That's a thing for another day.
Hana, getting back, I'm going to ask you the Pontius Pilate question, Hana. What is the relationship between truth and storytelling, and why is that important to when you're thinking about leadership and organizational leadership? Are the stories we tell in organizations true?
Sometimes, and sometimes they're not. And I will argue that most people do sense when there is a disconnect. And not necessarily, this is the hill I'm going to die on. And willingly, most people don't think their way into being better or feeling better or understanding the world. And as much as I love books and as much as I love literature and I want to, live in my prefrontal cortex forever, that's actually not a good idea. And most of the information we're getting is through the way our body processes it, or how
Mm-hmm.
we don't have the capacity, uh, for logic and language for a lot of information that we're actually getting. So that's why I'm a big proponent of embodiment and kind of looking at art as a way to see, okay, what resonates with you, what doesn't.
And can you
There's
talk a little bit more about what embodiment means? Because maybe the listeners aren't going to grok that.
okay,
To use a stranger in a strange land term.
So I'll give you a very specific example. You have a teenager, or you remember when you were a teenager, and the only place where you felt somewhat whole, everything was fragmented and disconnected and disjointed, and your body was weird, and the people around you were weird, and the parents were no longer heroes, and everything is a mess, and what's happening. And the only place where you feel calm is when you have a death metal band, way up in your room, and you're banging your head, and you're just like in that moment. You have no words for that, but your body is relaxing. Why? Because it seeks that sense, like, this is you approaching reality. There is it can make sense. I don't have words for it, but it can, somebody hears my frustration, somebody can put it in music, somebody can put it in a dance, like I can put it in dance. And to me, embodiment is all about understanding that a lot of your um, intelligence is in your body on a cellular level. And I blame St. Augustine, I blame Thomas Aquinas for that complete disconnect of, the two worlds, the sort of the spiritual and the natural. And
I think you're letting Descartes off too, right?
all of them. And there's this disconnect. And again, we're disregarding, and the Western culture is really terrible at this. We have been disregarding how we feel, how we sense. And this, right? You meet a person and there's a great energy about them, and your body senses it, even though what they're saying is it's not even making that much sense, but you're like, I like them. That to me.
I have in my profession, I do these things called alignment workshops, and some people would say that they're meant to get everybody to agree, and I always lead in: no one needs to walk out of an agreement. This is not about agreement. This is about everybody understanding where everybody's coming from, because agreement will come later. And in fact, we might finish this project, and you two might never agree, but the one thing you'll have to agree on is making a decision how to move forward. But if you can kind of understand each other, where each other come from, hearing each other's stories, because that's what the alignment shops are for, is getting alignment on the story, understanding, not necessarily agreement. And I think that's a big factor of us kind of understanding what it means to hear each other. It's like, doesn't necessarily mean that we have to agree. It's that we're developing, I think that's the word we use pretty regularly, and this is starting to come in my head. I'm hearing you talk, Hana, is empathy. We're trying to generate and connect with empathy. And so these tools come. This is a big tool for me. I use quite often, especially when.
But I want to be clear on this. I want to jump in a little bit on this. As a conflict management guy who led negotiation workshops and has taught conflict management and all that kind of good stuff back in the day. We struggle in the West, and Hana hit on something here that I think is very important with Augustine and Aquinas. And then we're getting into Descartes there a little bit. The West has struggled with the body since the beginning. So this is not a new struggle, right? Ever since the apostles in the Bible, the biblical narrative in the New Testament, stared slack-jawed at Jesus going up body into the heavens, as it says at the end of what is it? I think it's Matthew. They're all just stared up at the sky, and then an angel comes down and goes, "Why are you staring at the sky? Get out of here." If you look at the entire biblical narrative, it is a struggle between, again, the Judaic understanding of the Bible, or not the Bible, of the body being in the world, and the Greek understanding that's in the New Testament of this coolly rational thing that's just going to kind of come along. And you get a lot of that in the Pauline Gospels as well, or the Pauline writings as well, the letters and the encyclical pieces and all that. So it's even in our root documents, this struggle is in. So I absolutely laid at the feet of Augustine, laid at the feet of Aquinas, Descartes. Let's give him a punch in the mouth too, while we're going by, But just understand that we come by it honestly, and that is a very Western thing. The thing is, though, our philosophies have an Eastern touch to them, and the Eastern touch cares about the body. And so again, can two truths be equally correct, equally valid? Yes, they can. Can both those come together and create reality? Yes, they can. Now, for all your religious listeners out there who are going to be screaming about Gnosticism at you, I'm not going down the road of Gnosticism. I want to be very clear.
We'd love for people to scream at us on the comments section.
That'd be a rich man's problem. That'd be a nice problem to have. Hate us more, please. Let us hear about it.
But I do think that we are going to hit the pinnacle of this embodiment problem, and I don't know if Hana agrees or not, based upon what she's seeing. But I'm thinking we're going to hit the pinnacle of the embodiment problem with artificial intelligence. We're going to hit the pinnacle of that problem.
Oh man, you just did
a virtual reality
buzzword drop. I like it. We can put that in our tag now. AI, perfect.
You're welcome.
Chat GPT for the algorithm out there.
We should combine it with my question: what is human? And then we can complete that.
Complete the loop, the cycle.
Yeah.
I like it.
I want to go back to the original question, if I remember it correctly, that Dan was asking, which is sort of some of the stories that we tell ourselves and what's the danger and what is the benefit. And since we have Jesan here, I want to go sort of a literary route and bring this example of Albert Camus when he wrote The Fall. Remember, it's a so this Parisian lawyer is in Amsterdam, and Jean-Baptiste Clémence was his name, and he walks kind of inebriated, I think, home from somewhere, a bar, and hears a voice. It sounds like a woman falling in the water or falling somewhere. And there's that split second where he's like, well, somebody else is going to help her, blah, blah, blah. And he walks on.
Right.
And the why is it important? Because he has been telling himself, I'm this kind of person, right? I'm the person who is educated, who is helpful, who is blah, blah, blah. And then from that moment on, he's faced with, oh crap, in reality, when it comes to action, I am a very bad person. And the struggle, and of course, Sartre and Camus and all of them, I'm not a big fan. I like the books for a certain reason, but also like this is just the nihilism is not a good way, but it's to be, because it basically says there is no meaning, there is no, and to me, rejection is what some people will do. It kind of started this wave, and we're in it, right? Some people do reject completely that there is a meaning. There is no God, there is no meaning, there is no, it's just day to day.
But doesn't Sartre, isn't his thesis in existentialism as a humanism that in the absence of a God and in the absence of meaning, that it's incumbent upon the person to construct their own meaning? Like we have more agency in creating our narrative? And as to your point, Hana, also the agency to create a false narrative about ourselves that we don't live up to.
Well, right. Hana, were you stating that was your your thought, what you just said about no meaning?
No, I'm saying that
Yeah,
I think that
yeah.
it essentially, since the Industrial Revolution, and probably again, go back to Descartes and the death of the gods, really, and religion. There is this sort of, we are on this wave of, well, what is the point, right? Like, and some
Right.
people say, like the existentialists, like we are we have the agency and we have the power to create our own meanings, right? And some people say no, and I think that what's interesting in this context is to say the storytelling could be also very misleading. And maybe
Mm-hmm.
we don't make stories and make ourselves, a lot of people who meditate and who go um, sort of this route of, it's not that it doesn't matter, but your interpretation doesn't matter, right? Like, you're here now, your interpretation is about yesterday and it's about tomorrow, but you don't have that. That's gone, and that didn't happen yet. So all you have is right now, and you don't need a story for right now. All you need to do is to be, right? So there's also so you have several schools that are currently, like, we have this confluence of all these, and they're kind of battling it out, not
Mm-hmm.
necessarily in the open, and not everybody acknowledges that this is happening, but I believe that it is.
Mm.
And I would agree with Hassan that we have it, the power, it's the power of yes and, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not either or, it's yes, this is true, and
Mhm.
this is also true.
Mhm. Hey, son, I saw you almost bite your thumb about a minute ago. What was
So
your, what were you thinking?
I'm taking notes as Hana is talking, because she's throwing down just like stuff. It's amazing. She's throwing down.
Yeah, you want to be in my classroom sometimes. The students are like,
She's throwing lasers. She's chalking arrows at people. It's good. I love it. I love
I
it.
like that.
I will start off with my thought this way. I care very much about what happens in all of your house in what I'm about to say. So, I mean, literally, the house you live in. I care about what happens in your house, Jodah. I care about what happens in your house, Dan. I care about what happens in your house, Hana. I know it's scary how much I care about what happens in your house. And I've come to the realization over the course of, I would say, the last year, how flat the modern idea of we're just atomized beings walking around really is. Because what that does is it lets us off the hook, and it lets us off the hook into hedonism,
Yep.
or a weird form of asceticism that comes out as stoicism. And if I don't care about what happens in your house, then I'm letting myself off the hook for socially negotiating with you about reality, right? Then I don't have to socially negotiate with you about reality.
Yeah.
Your reality is just as cool as my reality. And by the way, take that to the logical conclusion. Who's to say that if you murder somebody in your house, I should have a problem with it?
Yeah, come to Portland. I think.
I think that's probably the stance in Portland. And so I've become really convicted on this at a moral level, and even down deeper at a spiritual level, that I have to care about what happens in your house. Now, where does that responsibility end? Which is what modern man would ask. How far does that go, and where does that responsibility end? Well, we'll see. I'm not at the end of my thought process on that, but I do know that in the existential mode of storytelling, and I read my fair share of Camus as well. Yeah, okay, you have agency to create your own narrative, but are you going to? And the answer that I would question Camus that in that way. I would question Sartre in that way. And by the way, if they were being intellectually honest and appropriately French, they would say, no, you're not going to create your own narrative. Instead, you're going to engage in, like I said, either hedonism or some weird form of asceticism. You're not going to create meaning out of that. And so G.K. Chesterton, has been.
Hmm.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Hey, Son,
Yeah.
real quick. So I understand what your
Yeah.
position, what you're saying. You're saying typically the human condition suggests you will not be
Typically.
creating meaning, that you're going to succumb to, which I think you're qualifying as probably, well, I'm going to qualify as like these two
Sure.
weaknesses that
Yeah.
you brought up, basically.
Yeah. And by the way, I want to be very clear on this. There are people who claim to have a story, but when you watch their behavior, they're not behaving in a way that matches their story. So I see this.
Well, yeah, that's what Hana
That's
was
right.
speaking toward, right?
I think it's typical, actually, right? I mean, we all have a narrative we told ourselves that we think
That's
we
right.
are, and how much we align
That's right.
is.
Well, that's part
defensive.
of our problem with storytelling. Is it's not just that we can't understand. We don't have the capacity to really interpret reality, the outside world. We have a hard time understanding ourselves
right.
too, and most of ourselves is
That's right.
invisible
Yeah.
to us.
Who are you? Who do you know who really you are? Have you done a deep dive into the deep recesses of who you are?
Again, it's too scary.
So wasn't that kind of why the Oracle said Plato was, or was it Plato that was the smartest, or
Socrates, yep.
Socrates was the smartest because, I mean, basically, because he was suggesting that he kind of actually
know
took
himself.
a moment to know
Correct.
himself, essentially.
And so
Yep.
engaging in that process of knowing yourself, and here's the thing, not engaging in never-ending navel gazing, but moving that knowledge out of Plato's cave into the light of reality. And then here's the hard part after you do that, making your behavior align with your story and being strict on that is hugely important. So I care about what happens in your house. I also care about you living out the courage of your convictions to whatever end that may be. And I would say that probably the person who I saw publicly anyway, probably lived that out the cleanest was Christopher Hitchens, interestingly enough. He was an atheist all the way to the moment of he was a David Hume
really
level
was.
atheist all the way to the end. I mean, when he was dying of cancer and religious people would walk up to him and say, "I am praying for you," he would say, "Thank you, but I'm not going anywhere." Who says that? Only a person who is living out their convictions all the way to the end.
So I will push back a little bit. So we will definitely need to have a conversation. I sense a little bit of you putting down my beloved Stoics, and I take umbrage. I take umbrage with that, but that's
okay.
a different story.
That's
I'm a huge.
No, that's good. We can touch on that a little bit. What defend the Stoics, Hana? I love the Stoics too.
But I would lose. Hold on. So I also want to say yes to Christopher Hitchens. The problem, huge fan, beautiful writer. But I think that, see, what you're saying is both beautiful and freaking dangerous, right? Like living your convictions, because we all have these narratives that we tell ourselves. So, and you can go to you did conflict resolutions, so all about the victim, perpetrator, rescuer triangle, right? And we are all, if you feel that you are the rescuer all the time and you live out your convictions, you might be the crusader. You might be the like the Spanish Inquisitor. You might be whatever it is that you are so damn certain that you're doing the right thing and that's what needs to happen. There's so many people who actually might be committing a lot of harm on others because they're so convinced that they are following on that righteous path. And that's where the storytelling is tricky, right? And we can take it from the literary world and from history to right now. You have CEOs who are firing people because they're convinced that they absolutely have to save the company. It's the company that needs to be saved, and these people have to go. And or you can look at opposite example, and again, it's aligned with what I truly believe. Most people believe they are good people, and all the atrocities and bad things that they're committing, They do because they believe they're the right thing to do. Very few people go, you know what, I just want to be a scumbag, or, oh, I just want to, commit harm. Like, no, yes, you're a psychopath next, but most people are not. I can give you a very specific example of somebody who's a top of her institution, and she came up through the ranks of student services. So in academia, we have the teachers on one end, and then you have the student services on the other. And for a long time, there's this push to, like, protect. And again, like, there's a lot that you need to do when you are heading a university or whatever you're heading. And for years, there needs to be decisions to cut certain positions. And if you feel like these are my people, it's my family, I have to protect them. Well, okay, what happens to the students who are then not getting the right education, or who don't have, like, the institution doesn't have money to hire enough, like, better faculty, or reward the faculty that they already have? Like, what that's what I'm talking about. Like, stories that might be harmful so often come from a very good place. That's what, like, the
Yeah.
storytelling.
Well, Road to Hell is covered with good intentions. I mean, I
100%.
literally just listened to an Alan Watts talk about virtue signaling, essentially, the good intentions, and he even suggests, like, your good intentions can be hurting you too. So.
Of course. And the stories so I will say, way back to the original question, like, the storytelling is important because it gives us meaning, and it helps us to see ourselves, and on that, in certain light, that usually is actually helpful, even though sometimes it is not. But another example, a story that I would bring up, is I was just rereading Dear Sugar, Cheryl Strayed book, which she wrote, Wild, the book that was later made into a movie. She's a beautiful, beautiful writer. And for years, she had this column, and people would write her, and she does not, it's not like advice column like any other. And at one point, she had a woman who's deeply depressed, completely, basically giving up on her life because she lost her daughter. And Cheryl Strayed, says just beautifully, you are currently on a planet, everybody else is on planet Earth, and you're on planet I lost my daughter. And it's a place that nobody, it's just, again, like, the writing is just
Great phrasing.
Beautiful. But what I'm saying is, you can find people who have lost their children. The absolute worst thing that can ever happen to a parent, right? Like, it doesn't get worse than that. Who got over that? There are people who got over their addictions, their losses, their trauma, and they were able to create a story for themselves that helps them move on. That's a huge power of storytelling. And you have people who have that trauma, and it's central to their story, who never get out of it, because they will always maintain that, like, they are anchored to that. And it's the only thing, sort of, the core thing that's defining them for years to come. Yeah. And they never get out. And what I'm saying is, the power, the beauty of storytelling that helps you get over terrible abuse or addiction or, loss. It's the meaning that good storytelling can give you is tectonic. It's beautiful, and it's powerful. And yes, and the storytelling that we sometimes tell ourselves is also very damaging, and it can be bad. And even though it comes from a good place, it's horrible, and you're probably going to harm a lot of people. And that's That's the problem with storytelling.
Hey, son, I want to give you a chance to respond. There's a lot there, but also when you're done, I'd like to see about if we can maybe pivot a little bit and start pulling it back to the organization leader and see what all this kind of means from a sense making perspective. Anyways, go ahead.
No, absolutely.
Respond, please.
A couple of thoughts occur to me. I think we have to separate, and this leads into this idea of what does this mean for leaders. I think we have to separate the individual story from the corporate story, right? And by corporate, I just mean the group, right? So you're going to get a corporate story in a family. A family is going to be a corporation, right? And I'm talking about the organization, right?
The
organization
story.
The organization story, right? You got to separate out those two stories, right? And so I agree with Hana in the fact that the individual can drive as a leader that corporate story. And we've, by the way, we've seen multiple evidence of that. All you have to do is go look at your LinkedIn feed on your desktop on the right hand side, and you'll just see all these kinds of people doing all this kinds of stuff, driving all kinds of different stories. So I don't have to belabor that. I think that's absolutely evident. Where I would push back on Hana a little bit here is that I think that I would rather live in a world, in a West, where people are driven by the power of conviction that they have developed, not in a reactive mode, but in a responsive mode, from the deepest part of their inner mind all the way to the outer limits of their reality that they can push out to. And I'm paraphrasing from that old show, Outer Limits. And I think that we have to distinguish between mindless conviction and mindful conviction. So mindful conviction is the type of conviction that the woman who started Mothers Against Drunk Driving after her daughter was killed in a drunk driving accident, right? That's mindful conviction. That's a woman who took her trauma, her story, and her organization that she founded and eventually left a couple of years later in the 80s has saved countless numbers of lives. That's mindful conviction. Mindless conviction is Lady Macbeth in Shakespeare. That's mindless conviction. A person who was pushing her husband, ambition for ambition's sake. That kind of mindless conviction. And so I think we have to distinguish between those two things. I also believe that we have to really wonder. Well, no, there's a great line in Joan Didion's Play It As It Lays, which we just recently covered on the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. That's my, that's the plug there. That's the plug in the show.
Your plug.
clever with that.
We'll add a link. We'll add a link to this episode. Yeah.
And if you look at our channels, so we have a link to Jesan's channel on our channel.
And there's the great opening line in Play It As It Lays. And I love Joan Didion for a variety of reasons. She's the ultimate sort of anti-Virginia Woolf, anti-Jane Austen kind of writer. I love her for that. But the very first line that Maria Wyeth says is, people wonder what makes Iago, people ask what makes Iago evil. I don't ask that anymore. And that's a hugely compelling thought to open up with. Iago, of course, is from Othello. He's driving he's the villain that drives the narrative. And there's no sense to Iago that he has anything underneath him at all, other than just naked ambition. That's it. That's the only thing you could pull from that. Iago was probably the first real existentialist, or maybe chaotic evil in Western literature.
Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah, exactly. And so, from those areas of the power of conviction, from getting meaning from a trauma-based story, I think we can come to the conclusion that it is better to encourage leaders in particular to really go inside and discover what their convictions are and what their story is, and then to begin to walk that out in some kind of meaningful way with caveats. And here are a few of the caveats. Here are a few of the boundaries, I would say. You've got to recognize that you're going to show up as a villain in somebody else's story, but you're also going to show up as a hero.
Oh, yeah. Especially in a leadership position.
And you also have to be willing to care about that other person's story. And too often I see so many leaders who are unwilling to care about what that other person's story is because it's not convenient, or it takes too
Mm.
long to hear, or they don't have the kind of time, or any of these other, to paraphrase again from Seinfeld, any of these yada, yada, yada excuses that just don't matter. They're just excuse making, right? And I think that we are at a moment where leadership has to really focus on taking action and not making any more excuses. No more excuses.
So I want to. I got maybe something that'll kind of start help us pivot and start to pull some of this together. You know, when I think about meaning making and storytelling, and especially from a leadership perspective, it's meaning making is about purpose making, right? Like what was the purpose? Why did this thing happen? You know, how can I make sense of what's happening to me at this particular moment? And what is my purpose? Well, you can take it to the more to the more existential, like in life, you know, or what is my purpose within the organization? And is it the job of the leader to help construct stories that help people figure out or understand what their purpose is within the organization and why it's meaningful? Um,
Let
yeah.
me add one more thing to that as well, kind of riffing off of what we just said. So there are narratives that we tell ourselves, and we are a species of rationalists. We rationalize the information against the narrative we have, and then there are stories that are being told to us. And the question is while I'm in my organization, a leader or something, I am trying to make meaning, but I've also got this narrative that I've told myself that is lensing my question. Like that meaning is referenced against what I think is meaningful, right? So it's my narration. How much does that leader or the organization, how much pull should it have to influence my internal narrative? Or is it merely about trying to align, making sure we're aligned naturally, and if not, see you in the next job or something like that, right? I mean, where does that mapping start to occur? Because I think
I'm glad you're bringing that up, because that was the other thing I wanted to get to, is that atomization that Jesan was talking about. Like,
yeah.
how do you get everyone on the same page as well?
Or do you? Is that what does it mean to have an organization where everybody isn't on the same page, and are you moving forward? So there's
Now that we've asked you like a dozen questions,
well,
go.
we're just framing, no question. Just there's no question here at all. We're just this kind of pulling it back. Yeah, what is so with all that sort of thinking? What is storytelling, and how is it meaningful for an organization and leader in today's world, basically?
So I will go back to some of the questions, and one of them being, what's the role of the leader? And I am a no nonsense, coach. So I really struggle with some of the latest ideas in leadership in particular, and articles that I read, and books that are being published. And in fact, I was just sitting on a call with Dave Snowden yesterday, and he goes,
Oh, really?
yeah, and
I'm
he goes,
envious.
well, anyway, I'll tell you more about it, but at one point he goes, I can't stand this. Like people go and interview 15 leaders, and then they write a book about it as if that meant anything. I'm paraphrasing. And I couldn't agree more, because the idea again goes back to this hunger for that one story, one way to be a leader. And there are these, I looked at the numbers, and it's, I think 75,000 books on leadership that
Oh,
Amazon
yeah.
has. And it's like, and yet we're not getting better. Not really. Not on that scale, 75,000, percent better. And so the idea that, you are going to discover how to be a good leader by reading a book is not necessarily, that's not going to happen. What I do agree with is what you said, Dan, and what Jesan was saying as well, is this introspection. Like, you actually have to figure out who you are before you can even, before you can lead anybody. You have to
Hmm.
understand your own story, your own narrative, how you can be helpful. What is it that you are bringing and discovering? And that needs to combine always with curiosity. The other question you had, Dan, and was, sort of the what is the level of storytelling that the leader should bring to the company, to the organization, versus, like, what is the level? And I will say, I think that the leader's role is to bring that curiosity and engage with the people in the organization, because
Hmm.
people have answers. They do want to, and they do have their ideas about the story, and it should be a collaborative process. You can't just show up and be like, this is what we're doing,
Yep.
and this is the company we are, and if you don't like it, see ya. Which, I think that it needs to be collaborative, and once
Hmm.
the people and sort of like get in that understanding of what we're doing, then you can be, and if this is not a place for you, then you can go somewhere else. But it needs to be, I'm not saying everybody has to agree, everybody has to be on the same page, but most people need to be somewhat moving in the same space, on a time space continuum. They have to be in the same spot. And again, I think last time I was here, we were talking about sort of what is a culture, and the storytelling is a part of the culture. So, it's an integral part of the culture. And I always say, you can have as many posters on the wall, and you can have as many bean bags and many pool tables as you want. But if you keep promoting toxic people, and or if you're promoting, like, whoever gets promoted is the first thing people look at, right? So one of the questions we discussed earlier was, is gossip part of the storytelling? Is, what kind of narrative goes around the water cooler? And the answer is, most people sense, something from your organization the moment they walk in, right? The energy is there or it's not. And that
Yeah.
goes back to the embodiment. But also,
I was
I'm
going to say,
looking
yeah.
who's being promoted. And if the person who's being promoted is a, underperformer who just fits certain narrative, and this is getting very, like, are you promoting me because I'm a woman? Like, is the only reason I'm being promoted that, I have certain, lady business that you don't have, and you want to do that? That's why? Then I don't want to be here. And or people have every right to be upset, because that's not, is it color of my skin? Is it my ethnic background? Why are you promoting me? Is it what I'm bringing to the table?
So that's
And we
interesting.
have,
There are tacit stories, and then there are implicit stories that leadership is probably very often not very much aware of, that they're transmitting through their behavior.
and it really is the behavior that matters. Like, the stories are nice and fine for the HR people and the writers of these, and designers of these posters, but ultimately it's the action. I think it goes back to what Jesan was talking about. And I think that's the role of the leader, to make sure that you are listening, you are curious, you ask questions, and understand sort of where your people are, and work with it. Like, people want some guidance, but they also want to express who they are, where they are, and what the organization they want.
Yeah. It sounds like the leader's discovering the story and co-constructing it with the organization, the people within the organization.
Hence sense making.
Yeah, for
Well,
sure.
I would also add to this, and we always forget this when we kind of have this conversation, and I agree with everything that Hana has said.
That.
That's why I paused at the end there.
It's a good story.
It's a good story.
It makes a good story. It's a feel-good story of the year.
Lifetime story.
It's a lifetime story. That's right.
I think that we have to teach people, or not teach people, we have to engage with people around following as well. So I think that's the other half of this equation that almost never gets talked about. We have an almost, and I'm a person who wrote a leadership book. Forgive me, Hana. I wrote a leadership book last year. Please forgive me. Mea culpa, mea culpa.
We forgave him.
Maxima
We forgave
culpa.
him last time.
You can pick it up on Amazon. 75,001.
I've written some articles on leadership. Including, incidentally, I just want to get this in, on construct proliferation, which is what you're kind of getting at, Hana, which is the concept that there have been proposed in the academic literature over 100 different theories of leadership, and they all mirror each other and overlap, and it becomes terrible for a leadership researcher because what variables are you trying to measure? But I just want to get that out there.
No,
go on, Jesan.
Go ahead, Hana. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt you and say I read all these books. I'm one of the idiots who actually go and buys those books and kind of look at them and talk, follows people, because I'm interested in figuring out if they have something to say. And some of them are wonderful, and
Right.
we wouldn't have the complexity scheme, and we wouldn't have a lot of great, things if it wasn't for people who actually can write a book like you, Jesan. So it's not all leadership, business. It's a whole industry. It's not all bad. I'm just saying there's a tendency to simplify.
Yes, and this
much.
is why the tagline on my podcast is because reading and trying to understand literature is better than reading and trying to understand yet another business book, right? Especially one that I wrote. So we've got that dynamic, but I think that there's two things that need to be hooked into what Hana said. The first thing that needs to be hooked in is this concept of followership, right? How do you be a good follower? We really push back and struggle with that in America, because the cultural narrative, the cultural story of America is everyone can lead all the time. And if everyone's not leading all the time, someone's slacking. Okay. And by the way, that's been the dominant cultural narrative for probably since the founding of the country. It's in the DNA of Americans. If you're listening to this podcast episode in another country, your DNA will vary, right? You're going to have a different kind of cultural story around leadership. The other thing, and well, let me close off that. So with that, we don't have a whole lot of good books written on how to be a good follower. How do you check your leader? We don't have a lot of good books that ask and answer that question. How do you challenge leadership effectively and respectfully while also keeping your job? How do you make sure that toxic people, which Hana was talking about this, how do you make sure that toxic people don't drag you down and don't get promoted? How do you make sure that the organizational culture is one you actually want to show up to and work in every day? And by the way, would be remarkable in the Seth Godin sense of the word, meaning worth talking about to somebody else when you get home. Not something that you just take off and put down and then pass out on the couch watching a Netflix show. Okay. How do you ensure that when you show up to work, it's not the leader's entire responsibility to make sure that you're showing up with your whole self, but that you are contributing to the environment that allows your whole self to be there? Remember that whole co-creation thing? Mm-hmm. Co-creation requires two people. Mm-hmm. It requires a leader and a follower. But we focus almost at an idolatrous level on the leader, and we say absolutely nothing about the followers.
That's interesting. It's like, I'm remembering that joke. That's enough about me. Let's talk about you. What do you think of me? What does all this mean to a leader? And as Dan knows, for me, the concept, and I think we're kind of actually breaking that down here. The notion of leader for me is not what what we've been talking about for the past 100 years, right? It is something else in this world of hyper connectivity and the ability for us to connect on levels that we haven't in the past, both because of enlightenment of the world around us and partially also because of probably technologies. But my question is, because Jesan, you kind of touched on it. So what does storytelling mean for me? What am I looking for from a story in relationship to the narrative that I have as a follower? And I'm going to use that word, a fellowship in a company. What does narration, what does a story, what are the implications of a story for me? What should I be looking for as a person who is a follower in an organization?
I think that if you are a follower in an organization, you need to be very clear about a couple of things. One, where you're coming from. Remember that whole finding out where your convictions things are? Yeah, you got to do the deep dive yourself the same way the leader does. But then the second thing you want to be looking for, and I want to make this very, very clean as I possibly can. You want to be looking for the practical walked out behavior of leadership. And if those two things aren't, and we've revisited this word over and over again, if the narrative and the walked out behavior are not aligned, if there's mismatch and friction, you need to have a serious conversation with yourself and with the people around you who you love about whether or not it is time for you to move into another role or move to another organization where the match is cleaner. Is that always possible for everybody economically? No, it's not. That's why you need to have that conversation. Is this always practical for an individual inside of an industry? No, it's not, which is why you need to have that conversation. Is it going to be easy? No, it's not. Congratulations. The worthwhile things are the hard things. Welcome to humanity, right? But you're going to have that conversation, make sure that alignment is occurring. Because here's the thing, if you don't make sure that alignment happens at a very practical level, you're going to wake up in, name your number of double-digit years here, wondering who you are with an ulcer and potentially an addiction. And by the way, you could be addicted to all kinds of things. It's not just the typical things that we think of. You could be addicted to anger. You could be addicted to stress. You could be addicted to work. You could be addicted to yelling at your kids. You could be addicted to doom scrolling on social media, or whatever we'll call it in 10 years. You could be addicted to dumping all kinds of things in Chat GPT 4 or whatever we'll be up to in 10 years and getting back some answers, or whatever the hot new thing will be. You could be addicted to turning off in the metaverse. Whatever it is you would like, pick your addiction. And don't worry, we'll find new things. That's your alternative option. And I want to close on that with what I said at the beginning. You're just going to reinforce your stranger in a strange land story if you don't get practical, if you don't seek that alignment, and if you don't have those conversations with people that you love. So that's my practical application for today.